I remember the exact moment my brother tried to sell my land like I was already dead. He stood there in my driveway smiling like a man who thought he'd already won. My father was beside him, arms folded, not even looking at me. And that realtor, nice blazer, clipboard, polite voice was already talking about square footage and listing prices like I wasn't standing 10 feet away. Daniel, Mark said like we were just catching up over coffee, this is going to help the family. The family. That word hit harder than anything else. I didn't raise my voice, didn't step forward, didn't argue. I just looked up toward the barn. Go ahead, I told him quietly. Say everything you need to say. Because every word was already being recorded. And none of them had any idea what was coming next. 3 months earlier, I had been sitting alone at my kitchen table on Christmas morning. No phone call. No invitation. Nothing. At 62 years old, you think you've seen just about every kind of disappointment life can throw at you. I served 25 years in the Army. I've buried friends. I've stood in places where the ground itself didn't feel safe. But there's something about being forgotten by your own family that hits different. It's quieter. Colder. I poured myself a second cup of coffee that morning and stared out the window at the frost clinging to the fence line. I told myself it was probably a mistake. Maybe the invitation got lost. Maybe my dad assumed I already had plans. But deep down I knew better. My younger brother Mark had always had a way of taking up all the oxygen in a room. Growing up, he needed help with everything: money, jobs, relationships, and my father was always there to catch him when he fell. Me. I learned early how to stand on my own 2 feet. At first, I thought that made my father proud. Later, I realized it just made me easier to overlook. Around noon, my neighbor Carl stopped by in his pickup. He didn't stay long, just handed me a tin of his wife's Christmas cookies and made some small talk about the weather. Then, just as he was getting ready to leave, he said something that stuck. You heading over to your dad's later? I looked at him. What for? Carl hesitated. Oh, I just figured Mark's got everyone over there today. That was it. That was how I found out. Not from a call, not from my father, not even from Mark. From a neighbor who assumed I was included. I nodded like it didn't bother me, thanked him for the cookies, watched his truck disappear down the road. Then I closed the door, leaned against it, and stood there in silence for a long time. There's a point in life where something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way you can't undo. That was my moment. I didn't call. I didn't confront anyone. I just made a decision. If I wasn't part of their table anymore, I'd build my own. 2 weeks later, I bought the ranch. It wasn't anything fancy. About 30 acres just outside town, with an old house that had seen better days and a barn that leaned a little too far to the left. The previous owner had passed away and his kids didn't want anything to do with the place. It had been sitting empty for nearly a year. Most people saw a fixer-upper. I saw something else. I saw quiet mornings, open space, a place where no one could decide whether I belonged or not. I paid for it outright using a portion of my retirement savings. No loans, no shared ownership, no strings attached. For the first time in a long while, something was completely mine. The first few weeks were hard work. The fence along the north side had collapsed in places, and I spent days hauling posts, stretching wire, and hammering staples until my hands ached. The house needed cleaning, real cleaning. Dust layered over everything like the place had been holding its breath. But I didn't mind. There's something honest about physical work. You fix what's broken. You see progress. You know exactly what you've earned at the end of the day. One morning while I was repairing the gate, a county truck pulled up. Out stepped Sheriff Tom Alvarez. Tom and I had known each other for years, not close friends, but the kind of acquaintances who respected each other. He'd retired from the state police before taking the sheriff position here. Didn't expect to see you out here, Daniel, he said, leaning against his truck. Didn't expect to be out here myself, I replied. He glanced around the property. You bought this place. Sure did. He nodded slowly. Good land. Just keep an eye on things. We've had a few property disputes around the county lately. Folks trying to claim land that isn't theirs. That caught my attention. Appreciate the heads up, I said. Tom gave me a look that felt more serious than casual advice. Might be worth putting up some cameras, just in case. I told him I'd think about it. That same afternoon, I drove into town and ordered a full camera system. Not because I expected trouble, But because after everything that had happened, I wasn't interested in being caught off guard ever again. A week later, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years. Laura Mitchell. She had been a JAG officer back when I was still in service, sharp, calm, under pressure, the kind of lawyer who didn't miss details. Now she had a small legal practice in town. We sat down over coffee, catching up on the years between then and now. Somewhere in the conversation, I mentioned the ranch. She listened carefully. Then she asked a question that made me pause. Everything squared away legally. Title's in my name, I said, paid in full. That's good, she replied, but I'd still recommend having everything reviewed. Deeds, filings, property lines. You'd be surprised how often issues come up, especially when family's involved. I didn't like how accurate that sounded. So I hired her. We went over everything. Every document. Every signature. Every filing. By the time she was done, there wasn't a single loose thread. Now, she said, handing me a folder, if anyone ever tries to challenge your ownership, they won't get very far. I nodded, feeling something settle in my chest. Not fear. Not anger. Just preparedness. Over the next couple of months, the ranch started to come back to life. The grass grew thicker. The fences stood straighter. The house felt warmer. I'd sit on the porch some evenings watching the sun dip behind the hills, and for the first time in years I felt something close to peace. I didn't hear much from my family. A couple of missed calls from my father, one short message from Mark about catching up sometime. I didn't respond. Not out of spite. Just distance. Sometimes silence says everything that needs to be said. Then came the day everything changed. It was a cold afternoon wind cutting across the fields as I worked on the fence line near the driveway. I heard engines before I saw them. 3 vehicles. One I recognized immediately, my father's truck. The second was Mark's. The third? A sedan I didn't know. They pulled in like they belonged there. Like this place wasn't mine. Like I was just a detail they'd deal with later. I set my tools down slowly and walked toward them. Mark stepped out first, smiling. That same confident smile he always wore when he thought things were going his way. "Hey, Dan," he said casually, "we need to talk." Behind him, the realtor stepped out, already glancing around the property. Measuring. Assessing. Calculating. And in that moment, I understood exactly what they had come to do. Part 1. The Christmas I was left out. Word, count, 1042. Continue Part 2. The ranch that became my freedom. Mark walked toward me like he owned the place. Behind him, the realtor stepped carefully across the gravel driveway, clipboard tucked under his arm, already scanning the house and pasture like a man mentally preparing a listing description. My father stayed near the truck. He didn't say hello. Didn't meet my eyes. That silence told me more than anything else. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Mark rubbed his hands together like he was about to deliver good news. "Well, Dan, we've been talking things over," he said. "Dad and I figured it's time to make a smart move with this property." I looked past him toward the barn. The small camera mounted under the eave blinked quietly. "Recording." "Good." Because something told me this conversation was about to matter later. "What kind of smart move?" I asked. The realtor stepped forward with a polite smile. "Sir, my name is Kevin Walters. I specialize in rural listings in this county. Your brother reached out about selling the property, and I thought I'd stop by to take a look." Selling. The word hung in the air like smoke. I stared at him for a moment. Then back at Mark. "Selling my property." Mark waved a hand dismissively. "Well, technically, yeah, but it's really more about helping the family." There it was again. That word. Family. Funny how it only seemed to apply when someone needed something from me. Before I could respond, Kevin began walking slowly along the fence line, glancing across the pasture. 30 acres, right, he said. "Land like this could easily bring a solid price, especially if we market it as a starter ranch." Starter ranch. I'd spent 3 months rebuilding fences, clearing brush, fixing broken gates, and repairing the barn roof. Now a stranger was casually discussing its resale value like it was a used pickup truck. "Kevin," I said calmly, "you might want to hold off on that." He paused. Mark frowned slightly. "Dan, don't make this harder than it needs to be," Mark said. That was the moment I realized something important. They weren't asking. They were assuming. Assuming I'd step aside. assuming I'd go along with whatever plan they'd already cooked up. Assuming I was still the quiet older brother who didn't make waves. I looked at my father. "Dad, I said you want to explain what's happening." He shifted his weight and finally looked up. Well, he began slowly. Mark's been having a rough time lately. Of course he had. Mark had been having a rough time for 40 years. Failed businesses. Bad investments. Borrowed money that never seemed to come back. And I asked. Dad cleared his throat. We figured this land could help him get back on his feet. I waited. No one said the obvious part. So I said it for them. You figured you'd sell my ranch. Mark stepped forward again. Look, Dan, don't say it like that. It's still family land. No, I replied quietly, it isn't. The wind moved through the pasture grass behind us, rustling like distant whispers. Kevin, the realtor, glanced between us, beginning to realize he had stepped into something uncomfortable. Maybe we should just talk about this calmly, he offered. Mark ignored him. You bought this place with Dad's inheritance money anyway, he said. That stopped me cold. Excuse me? Mark shrugged. Dad told me you used the family money after Grandma passed. I turned slowly toward my father. Is that what you told him? Dad avoided my eyes. Well, I thought... You thought what I asked. That you didn't need it the way Mark does, he said quietly. For a moment no one spoke. I could hear the distant creak of the barn door swaying slightly in the wind. The same barn I'd spent 2 full days reinforcing. The same barn that now held 3 cameras pointed directly at the driveway. I took a breath. Then another. Anger would have been easy. But anger makes people sloppy. And I wasn't interested in being sloppy. Let's clear something up, I said. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my phone. Not to call anyone yet. Just to check something. The security app showed all 3 camera feeds active. Recording. Audio included. Good. Mark crossed his arms. Look, Dan, we're not trying to screw you here. The land could sell for a lot right now. Dad and I talked about it. You talked about it, I corrected. Kevin stepped closer, clearly trying to salvage the situation. If there's been a misunderstanding, we can certainly sort things out, he said. I appreciated that he at least seemed uncomfortable. But the truth was simple. There was no misunderstanding. Just assumption. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. You're right, I said calmly. Mark's expression relaxed slightly, like he thought he was winning. We should sort things out. Dad nodded in relief. That's all we're asking. Kevin smiled politely. Maybe we could step inside and go over some numbers. No need, I said. They all looked at me. Everything we need to discuss can happen right here. Mark sighed. Dan, don't drag this out. We've already got a buyer interested. That made me laugh. A quiet laugh. Of course you do. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of hay from the barn. I looked toward the dirt road leading up to the property. Empty for now. But not for long. Mark noticed where I was looking. What he said, expecting someone. I nodded. Actually, yes. Dad frowned. What are you talking about? I pointed toward the barn. See that camera up there? Kevin looked up. Mark squinted. So I said calmly, everything that's been said since you pulled into my driveway has been recorded. Kevin's eyes widened slightly. Mark's smile faded. Dad shifted uncomfortably. Why would you do that? Mark asked. I shrugged. Because Sheriff Alvarez suggested it. That name changed the air instantly. Mark blinked. The sheriff? Yes. Kevin took a small step backward. Dad looked nervous now. Mark tried to recover. Okay, and I continued, there's one more thing you should know. I reached into my jacket again. This time I pulled out a folded folder. The same one Laura Mitchell had handed me weeks earlier. Property deed. Purchase documents. Legal filings. Every page stamped and certified. You see, I said slowly, I didn't buy this ranch with family money. I opened the folder. I bought it with my retirement savings. Kevin leaned forward, suddenly very interested. Mark looked irritated. Fine, he said. But that doesn't change the fact that we can still sell it if... No, I interrupted. That's exactly what it changes. And just then, a pickup truck appeared at the end of the road. County Sheriff's Department markings bright against the dust. Tom Alvarez always had good timing. Mark saw the truck too. What the hell is this? He muttered. I closed the folder and slipped it under my arm. This, I said quietly, is the part where things start getting interesting. Part 2. The ranch that became my freedom. Word count 1028. Continue Part 3. The day they showed up with a realtor. The sheriff's truck rolled slowly up the dirt driveway, tires crunching over the gravel like thunder in the quiet afternoon. Sheriff Tom Alvarez didn't rush. Tom never rushed. He parked beside my father's truck, shut off the engine, and sat there for a moment like he was giving everyone time to think about their choices. Then he stepped out. The cold wind lifted the collar of his brown sheriff's jacket as he walked toward us. Tom glanced at me first. Just a small nod. The kind men who've seen real trouble use when they're checking if everything is still under control. You called Daniel? He asked calmly. I did, I said. Behind me, Mark shifted his weight. This isn't necessary, he muttered. Tom turned toward him slowly. That depends, Tom said, voice steady. What's going on here? Mark tried to regain his confidence. Oh, nothing serious, he said. Just a family discussion. Kevin the realtor cleared his throat quietly. Yes, well, I was invited here to evaluate the property for a potential listing. Tom looked from Kevin to Mark to my father. Then back to me. Your property, Daniel. Yes, sir. Tom folded his arms. And you invited them here to list it. Number. That one word changed everything. Kevin's posture stiffened. Mark's jaw tightened. My father looked like he wished he was anywhere else. Tom nodded slowly. All right then, he said. Let's take this one step at a time. He turned to Kevin. You're the realtor. Yes, sir, Kevin replied. You were told the property owner wanted to sell. Kevin hesitated. Well, I was told the family was planning to sell. Tom raised one eyebrow. Family planning doesn't equal ownership. Kevin didn't argue. Mark stepped forward again, frustration creeping into his voice. This is ridiculous, he said. Dad and I have every right to be here. Tom looked at him calmly. Being here and selling someone else's property are two different things. Mark pointed toward the house. It's family land. No, I said quietly, it isn't. Mark turned toward me, irritation flaring. You always do this, Dan. Always acting like you're separate from the rest of us. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I opened the folder under my arm and handed the top document to Sheriff Alvarez. Tom read it carefully, then flipped to the second page. Then the third. Finally, he looked up. This property is fully deeded to Daniel Carter, he said. Purchased outright, no co-owners listed. Kevin leaned closer to read the paperwork. His expression changed immediately. Mr. Carter, he said carefully, if that's the case, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Mark let out a sharp laugh. There's no misunderstanding. Tom looked back at him. You sure about that? Mark crossed his arms. Dad told me this land came from Grandma's inheritance. My father shifted uncomfortably. Tom glanced at him. Mr. Carter. Dad sighed. I thought, well, Daniel didn't really need the money. That sentence landed heavier than anything else. Not because it was new, but because it was the first time he'd said it out loud. Mark seized on it. See, Dad said it himself. Tom held up a hand. That still doesn't give anyone the right to sell property that legally belongs to someone else. Kevin stepped back another step. I'm going to remove myself from this situation, he said quickly. Clearly, I wasn't given accurate information. Smart man. He started walking toward his car. Mark glared at him. Seriously? Kevin didn't stop. I sell property, he said over his shoulder. I don't participate in legal disputes. Within seconds, he was back in his sedan and pulling down the driveway. That left just the four of us. 5 counting Tom. The wind picked up again, rattling the loose chain on the gate. Mark rubbed his face with both hands. This is unbelievable. Tom tilted his head slightly. What exactly is unbelievable? That Daniel's acting like we're criminals. Tom looked toward the barn. Funny thing about that, he said. Mark followed his gaze. What? Tom pointed. You see that camera up there? Mark stared. And Tom continued calmly, that camera records audio. Mark went very still. Tom continued. So, if someone came onto this property and attempted to sell land they didn't own, that recording could become evidence. My father swallowed hard. Mark's confidence started to crack. That's not what we were doing, he said quickly. Tom didn't raise his voice. Then explain what you were doing. Mark hesitated. For the first time since he arrived, he didn't have an immediate answer. Finally, he pointed at me. We were trying to help the family. Tom nodded slowly. Help them how? Mark gestured around the ranch. Selling this land, using the money to get my business running again. Tom looked back at me. Daniel, you authorize that. Number. That single word seemed to echo across the pasture. Tom nodded once more. Well then, he said that sounds like attempted fraud. Mark exploded. Fraud. Tom shrugged slightly. Attempting to sell property you don't own tends to fall into that category. My father stepped forward suddenly. Now wait just a minute. Tom held up his hand. Sir, I'm not accusing anyone yet. Yet. The word hung there like a warning. Mark ran a hand through his hair. This is insane. No, I said quietly. What's insane is showing up at someone's home with a realtor and assuming they'll just hand over the deed. Mark stared at me. You really called the sheriff on your own family. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered honestly, Number. I nodded toward the road. I called him because I had a feeling you might try something like this. Mark's face tightened. Tom folded the paperwork and handed it back to me. You've got solid documentation, he said. I know. Tom looked at Mark and my father again. So here's where things stand. He spoke calmly, but every word carried weight. This land belongs to Daniel Carter. He pointed toward the driveway. You're welcome to leave peacefully. Then his voice dropped slightly. But if this conversation continues in a way that suggests coercion or attempted fraud, I'll have to take it further. Silence settled over the ranch. Mark stared at the ground. My father looked older than I remembered. The wind blew through the pasture grass again, whispering across 30 acres that were finally unquestionably mine. But the truth was, the real confrontation was only just beginning. Part 3, the day they showed up with a realtor word count, 1,032. Continue Part 4, the moment everything turned. For a few long seconds, nobody spoke. The wind moved slowly across the pasture behind us, bending the winter grass in quiet waves. Somewhere near the barn, a loose piece of tin rattled softly. Sheriff Alvarez stood with his hands resting calmly on his belt. He wasn't threatening. He didn't need to be. Men like Tom had a way of letting silence do most of the work. My brother Mark stared at the dirt near his boots, jaw tight. My father looked like he was trying to figure out how everything had gotten so far out of his control. Finally, Mark spoke. You're really going to push this, he said, looking at me. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I studied him the way you study someone you've known your whole life but suddenly don't recognize. Mark was 58 now. His hair had thinned, and the lines around his eyes had grown deeper. But the expression on his face was the same one I'd seen since we were teenagers, the look he wore whenever things didn't go his way. You showed up here with a realtor, I said quietly. Yeah, because you won't answer your phone, he snapped. That's not the same thing as asking to sell my land. Mark threw up his hands. Dad told me the money came from the inheritance. The words hung there again. The inheritance. I turned slowly toward my father. He stood near the truck, shoulders slumped slightly like a man who had just realized he was standing in the middle of a storm he helped create. Dad, I said, did you tell Mark the ranch belonged to both of us? He hesitated. Well, not exactly. Mark spun toward him. What do you mean, not exactly? Dad rubbed his forehead. I told him you used the money from your share of your grandmother's estate. That's not the same thing I said. Mark's head snapped toward me. Wait, what? I opened the folder again and pulled out one of the documents Laura had helped prepare. Grandma left me $60,000, I said. That was 10 years ago. Mark frowned. So the ranch cost $240. He blinked. You're saying... I'm saying, I continued calmly, that the inheritance covered about 1/4 of the purchase. The rest came from my retirement savings. Money I earned. Money I set aside. Money no one else had anything to do with. Mark looked at my father again. You said it was family money. Dad's voice was small now. I assumed Daniel wouldn't mind helping. That word again. Helping. Helping Mark out of another hole. Helping the family. Helping everyone except the person who actually owned the land. Mark shook his head slowly. So what, you're just keeping it all to yourself? I let out a quiet breath. Number. I'm keeping what belongs to me. Tom Alvarez shifted slightly beside us. Gentlemen, he said calmly, I'm starting to think this might be a good place to end the conversation. But Mark wasn't finished. He pointed toward the pasture. Do you even know what that land is worth right now, he said. Developers are buying property all over this county. You could sell this place and walk away with $500,000. I know, I said. And you'd rather keep it? Yes. Mark stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Why? That question lingered in the cold air. For a moment, I didn't answer. Because the truth wasn't about money. It was about something much older. You want to know why, I said finally? Mark nodded impatiently. I looked around the ranch. The repaired fence lines. The barn roof I'd spent 2 long weekends fixing. The porch light glowing softly on the house behind us. I bought this place because it's the first thing in my life that belongs completely to me, I said. Mark scoffed. You've always had everything. I felt something tighten in my chest. Have I? Mark shrugged. You had the army career, the pension, the respect. And what did that cost me, I asked quietly. He didn't answer. Neither did my father. Because they both knew. 25 years away from home. Missed birthdays. Missed holidays. Friends buried under folded flags. Things Mark had never had to think about. I wasn't angry about those years. But I wasn't going to pretend they meant nothing either. You think I bought this ranch because I needed more money, I said. Mark shrugged again. Then why? I looked at him for a long moment. Because last Christmas morning I was sitting alone in my kitchen. Mark blinked. What? You heard me. My father shifted slightly. Daniel. No, I said gently. Let me finish. I looked directly at Mark. You were all at Dad's house. Christmas dinner. Presents. Family. He frowned. How do you... Carl Thompson told me. Mark's mouth closed. I never got an invitation, I continued. My father's face drained of color. I thought you were busy, he said weakly. You thought wrong. The words weren't angry. They were just honest. And honesty can cut deeper than shouting. I realized something that morning, I said quietly. I wasn't part of the family table anymore. The wind moved through the pasture again, carrying the faint smell of cold earth and hay. Mark stared at the ground. My father looked like he was remembering something he wished he could take back. That's why I bought the ranch, I said. Not for money. For peace. For a place where no one could decide whether I belonged or not. Sheriff Alvarez cleared his throat softly. Well, he said that certainly puts things in perspective. Mark ran both hands through his hair. So what now, he asked. I closed the folder and tucked it under my arm again. Now, I said calmly, you leave my property. The words were simple. Not dramatic. Just final. Mark looked toward my father. Dad didn't say anything. Finally, Mark exhaled sharply. Fine. He turned toward the truck. But before he reached it, he stopped. Don't expect me to forget this, he muttered. I didn't respond. Because the truth was, the hardest part of the story still hadn't been told. And neither of them had any idea what was coming next. Part 4. The moment. Everything turned. Word count. 1019. Continue Part 5. The truth finally comes out. Mark had his hand on the truck door when he stopped. The anger that had been pushing him all afternoon seemed to stall like a truck spinning its tires in mud. He turned back toward me. You know what the worst part of this is, he said. Sheriff Alvarez didn't move. He simply watched, giving the moment room to breathe. I leaned slightly against the fence post beside me. Go ahead, I said. Mark laughed once short and bitter. You've always done this. Done what? Acted like you're better than everyone. The accusation wasn't new. I'd heard versions of it since we were teenagers. But hearing it now standing in the middle of land I'd spent months rebuilding with my own hands, it sounded different. Calmer. Almost tired. I never said I was better, I replied. Mark shrugged. You didn't have to. He kicked a small rock across the driveway. You had the army career. Everyone in town talks about you like you're some kind of hero. Sheriff Alvarez gave a small cough. That's because he served 25 years, Tom said. Mark waved his hand. Yeah. And now you've got this ranch. His voice dropped slightly. And I've got nothing. That sentence hung in the air longer than the others. For the first time that afternoon, Mark didn't sound angry. He sounded worn out. Sheriff Alvarez glanced at me, then quietly stepped a few feet away, leaning against the hood of his truck. Not leaving. Just giving us space. I looked at my brother. What happened, Mark? He laughed again, but there wasn't any humor in it. You really don't know. Number. He ran his hands down his face. The construction business collapsed last year. I heard something about that. Yeah, he said, because the bank took everything. That part I hadn't heard. Mark looked toward the pasture like he was watching ghosts move through the grass. Equipment loans, materials, payroll. One job went bad, and the whole thing started falling apart. My father shifted beside the truck. Mark? But Mark wasn't finished. Then the market slowed down, he continued. 3 more projects canceled. His voice grew quieter. I tried to hold it together. I believed that. Mark had always been stubborn. Sometimes that stubbornness looked like determination. Sometimes it looked like disaster. And the debts I asked? Mark nodded slowly. 200,000. Even Sheriff Alvarez raised his eyebrows at that. My father stepped forward now. I told him we'd figure something out, Dad said. Mark laughed bitterly. Yeah, Dad had a plan. My father looked uncomfortable. We thought maybe Daniel could help. That sentence felt like an old wound reopening. Not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed exactly what I had suspected. Mark gestured toward the ranch again. Dad said if we sold this place we could clear the debts and start fresh. And you believed that I asked? Mark shrugged. Why wouldn't I? Because the land wasn't yours. Because you never asked. Because you assumed. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since they arrived. Why didn't you just come talk to me? Mark looked at me like the answer should have been obvious. Because you stopped answering our calls. That was after Christmas. My father looked down at the ground. That Christmas thing was a misunderstanding. No, I said softly. It wasn't. The cold air settled between us again. Mark shifted his weight. You really let that bother you this much? I looked at him. You ever sit alone on Christmas morning while the rest of your family celebrates 2 miles down the road? He didn't answer. Neither did my father. Because they both knew the answer. Number. They hadn't. Mark finally rubbed the back of his neck. We thought you were busy. You didn't ask. My father spoke quietly now. We didn't think it mattered. That might have been the most honest sentence he'd spoken all day. And it landed harder than anything else. I nodded slowly. Exactly. The silence that followed wasn't angry anymore. It was heavier. The kind of silence that comes when people start realizing how much damage they've done without noticing. Sheriff Alvarez stepped forward again. Gentlemen, he said gently, we've reached the point where this is either going to end peacefully or get complicated. Mark looked at him. Meaning what? Meaning Tom replied that Daniel could file a complaint right now for attempted fraud and coercion. Mark's head snapped toward me. You'd really do that? I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was, I had thought about it. Laura Mitchell had explained the legal side weeks ago. If someone attempted to pressure a property owner into selling land they didn't own, especially with a realtor involved, that could become a serious legal problem. Mark could face charges, real charges. The kind that follow a man for the rest of his life. I looked at my brother. Then at my father. 2 men who had spent the afternoon trying to take something that mattered deeply to me. And yet, they were still my family. Mark spoke again, quieter now. I was desperate, Dan. My father nodded slowly. We both were. That was the first time either of them admitted it. Desperation. Fear. Bad decisions built on bad assumptions. I took a long breath. Then I looked toward Sheriff Alvarez. Tom, I said. Yes. I'm not filing anything. Mark blinked. What? My father looked confused. Sheriff Alvarez tilted his head slightly. You sure about that? Yes. Mark stared at me. Why? I thought about that question carefully before answering. Because the truth was complicated. I spent 25 years in the army, I said. I've seen what real enemies look like. I looked at my brother again. You're not one of them. Mark's shoulders sagged slightly. But this doesn't mean nothing happened today, I added. He nodded slowly. I know. The wind moved through the pasture again. And for the first time since they arrived, the anger was gone. But the story still wasn't finished. Because the next decision I made would change everything between us. Part 5. The truth finally comes out. Word count 1021. Continue Part 6. A choice between revenge and peace. No one spoke for a while after that. The kind of quiet that settled over us wasn't the same as before. It wasn't tense or sharp. It felt worn down. Like something had been pulled apart and laid out in the open, and now we all had to decide what to do with it. Sheriff Alvarez shifted his stance and looked at me. Daniel, he said, calm as ever, I'm going to ask you one more time. You want to pursue this legally, I'll back you. You've got documentation, you've got recorded audio, you've got witnesses. I nodded. I understand. Tom gave a small shrug. Then it's your call. I looked at my brother. Then at my father. 2 men who had just tried to sell my land without asking. 2 men who had left me sitting alone on Christmas morning. 2 men who for most of my life had treated me like I didn't need anything. And yet, they were still the only family I had left. Mark spoke first, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. If you want to press charges, he said, I won't fight it. That surprised me. Mark had spent most of his life arguing his way out of responsibility. Now he just stood there, shoulders slumped like a man who had finally run out of excuses. My father cleared his throat. This is my fault, he said. Mark shook his head. No, Dad. Yes, Dad interrupted, his voice stronger now. I told you things that weren't true. I assumed Daniel would help without asking him. He looked at me. I've been doing that for years. That was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him. It didn't fix everything. But it mattered. I took a slow breath. Here's what's going to happen, I said. Both of them looked at me. So did Sheriff Alvarez. I'm not pressing charges, I continued. Mark exhaled relief flickering across his face. But I raised a hand. That doesn't mean we just walk away like nothing happened. His expression tightened again. Then what? I looked out across the pasture. The land I'd spent months rebuilding. The land they had almost taken without a second thought. This ranch isn't for sale, I said. Not now, not later, not for any reason. Mark nodded slowly. I get that. Good. I turned back toward him. But you said you owe $200,000. His jaw tightened. Yeah. You planning to run from that? He shook his head. Number. Good, I said again. Because that was the first step. Owning your mistakes. I paused for a moment, choosing my next words carefully. Because this part mattered. I'm not going to give you money, I said. Mark didn't react. I think he already knew that answer. But I continued, I am going to offer you something else. He looked up. My father leaned forward slightly. Sheriff Alvarez crossed his arms, listening. You can work here, I said. Mark blinked. What? This ranch needs work, I explained. Fence repairs, livestock setup, maintenance. It's not finished yet. He stared at me, confused. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a chance. The words came out steady. Clear. Not emotional. Just honest. Mark let out a short laugh. You're serious. Very. He looked around the property again. This is a lot of work. I know. I don't know anything about running a ranch. You'll learn. He shook his head. And what, you're just going to pay me enough to cover my debts? Number. That stopped him. I'll pay you a fair wage, I said. What you do with it is up to you. Mark frowned. That's going to take years. Yes. The word sat there between us. Years. No shortcuts. No bailouts. No quick fixes. Just work. The kind of work I had been doing since I bought the place. Mark looked at my father. Dad didn't say anything. For once, he wasn't stepping in. This decision was Mark's. Mark turned back to me. Why, he asked. Why would you help me after everything? I thought about that. About the anger I'd felt that morning. About the silence on Christmas. About the way they had stood in my driveway like I didn't matter. Then I answered him. Because if I take everything from you the way you tried to take from me. I paused. Then we both lose. Mark swallowed hard. Sheriff Alvarez gave a small nod like he approved of the answer. My father looked like he was seeing me for the first time in years. Mark ran a hand through his hair again. Then he let out a long breath. "Okay," he said. "Okay, what?" "I'll do it." "You're sure?" He nodded. "I don't have a lot of options." "That's true," I said. "But this isn't about options, it's about choices." He met my eyes. "I'm choosing to try." That was the first honest thing he'd said all day. I respected that. I extended my hand. For a second he hesitated. Then he stepped forward and shook it. His grip was firm. Not confident, but real. Sheriff Alvarez clapped his hands once. "Well," he said, "that's about as good an outcome as I've seen in a situation like this." He looked at me. "You sure you don't want to file anything?" "I'm sure." Tom nodded. "All right then, I'll consider this resolved." He turned toward his truck, then paused. "Oh, and Mark." Mark looked up. "Yeah." Tom gave him a look that carried just enough weight. "Don't make me come back out here for something like this again." Mark shook his head quickly. "You won't." "I hope not." With that, Sheriff Alvarez climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving a trail of dust behind him. The ranch grew quiet again. Just the three of us now. Me. My brother. My father. The wind moved through the pasture. Same as before. But something had changed. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. I looked at Mark. "Be here tomorrow morning," I said. "What time?" 6. He blinked. 6. I nodded. "Sunrise doesn't wait." He let out a small, tired laugh. "All right." He walked back to his truck. My father lingered for a moment. "Daniel," he said quietly. I looked at him. I was wrong. I didn't respond right away. Because some words take time to settle. Finally, I nodded. "I know." He gave a small, almost grateful smile. Then he turned and followed Mark. I stood there for a long time after they left, looking out across the land. The place I had built for myself. The place no one could take. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while. Not victory. Not relief. Something quieter. Something stronger. Peace. But the story wasn't over yet. Because some things take time to grow. And the next Christmas would be very different. Part 6. A choice between revenge and peace. Word. Count 1048. Continue Part 7. The next Christmas. The first morning Mark showed up, he was 10 minutes late. That told me two things. First, he hadn't taken me seriously when I said 6 o'clock. Second, he was about to learn that I meant exactly what I said. I was already out by the barn when his truck pulled in, the sky just beginning to lighten along the horizon. The air had that sharp winter bite to it, the kind that wakes you up faster than coffee ever could. He stepped out, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. "Morning," he said. "You're late," I replied. He glanced at his watch. "It's only 10 minutes. I looked at him for a long second. Then I handed him a pair of work gloves. "Fence line on the east side needs reinforcing," I said. "Posts are loose, wires sagging." He blinked. "No good morning, no coffee, no." "This is the job," I said. He sighed, pulled on the gloves, and followed me out to the field. That first week was hard on him. Harder than he expected. Ranch work doesn't care about your past, your excuses, or your pride. It just demands that you show up and do what needs to be done. By the third day, his hands were blistered. By the fifth, his back hurt. By the end of the first week, he stopped complaining. That was the first sign something was changing. We fell into a routine. 6 in the morning. Coffee on the porch. Then work. Some days we barely talked. Other days we talked about everything except the past. Weather. Tools. Repairs. The kind of simple conversations that don't fix anything overnight, but start to rebuild something underneath. Mark wasn't a natural at ranch work, but he was stubborn. And for the first time in his life, that stubbornness worked in his favor. He learned. He asked questions. He made mistakes and then fixed them. That mattered more than anything. My father started coming by about 2 weeks in. The first time he didn't stay long. Just stood near the truck watching us work. I walked over. "You need something?" I asked. He shook his head. No, just checking in. That wasn't like him. He'd spent most of his life stepping in, making decisions, fixing problems for Mark, before Mark even had a chance to try. Now he just stood there, watching, learning. The next time he came, he brought coffee. Didn't say much. Just handed us both a cup and leaned against the fence. By the third visit, he picked up a hammer and helped repair the barn door. No speeches. No explanations. Just quiet effort. That was new. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted in patches, revealing the dark soil underneath. The pasture began to breathe again. Grass pushed through. Fences held. The ranch started to look less like a project, and more like a place. Mark changed too. It didn't happen all at once. There was no big moment. Just small ones. He started showing up early. He stopped checking his phone every 10 minutes. He began talking about the future, not in terms of quick fixes or big plans, but in terms of steady progress. One afternoon, while we were repairing a section of fence, he said something that stayed with me. "I should have asked you," he said. I didn't look up from the wire I was tightening. "Yeah," I replied. He nodded. "I didn't think you'd say yes." "That's not the point." "I know." We worked in silence for a while after that. Then he added quietly, "I didn't think you'd listen." That one hit deeper than I expected. Because maybe in his mind I had already stopped being part of the family long before that Christmas. By summer, things felt different. Not perfect. Not completely fixed. But better. Mark had paid off a portion of his debt. Not a lot. But enough to prove he was serious. My father came by almost every week now. Sometimes to help. Sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk. One evening he said something I hadn't expected. "I was wrong about you," he said. I looked at him. "How?" "I thought you didn't need us," he admitted. "That you were fine on your own." I nodded slowly. "I was fine." He shook his head. "That's not the same thing." No, it wasn't. When winter came again, the ranch was stronger than it had been the year before. The fences held. The barn stood straight. The house felt warm. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. A week before Christmas, I made a decision. Not because I had to, but because it felt right. On Christmas Eve, the ranch was lit up. Nothing fancy. Just simple lights along the porch. A tree inside the house. The smell of food drifting through the air. Mark arrived first, carrying a tray of something he insisted on calling homemade, even though I suspected it came from a store in town. My father came next. Slower than before, but steady. Then a little later, Sheriff Alvarez pulled in. "Didn't think I'd miss this," he said with a small smile. And behind him, Laura Mitchell. Still sharp. Still observant. Still the reason my ranch was legally untouchable. We all gathered inside. No tension. No arguments. Just conversation. Real conversation. The kind that had been missing for years. At one point, Mark looked around the room and shook his head. "Hard to believe this started with me trying to sell the place," he said. I smiled slightly. "Yeah," I said. "It is." My father looked at me then. "I should have invited you last year," he said. I met his eyes. "Yes," I replied. Then I added more gently, "But we're here now." And that was enough. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood on the porch. The cold air settled around me. The land stretched out in front of me, quiet, steady mine. But no longer just mine. Because something had grown here over the past year. Not just fences. Not just buildings. Something harder to build. Trust. Understanding. A second chance. I thought back to that moment in the driveway. The anger. The betrayal. The choice I had made. I could have taken everything from Mark. Legally. Easily. But that wouldn't have fixed anything. It would have just broken things further. Instead, we built something better. Not perfect. But real. If you've made it this far, maybe you've lived long enough to know this too. Family isn't about who shows up when things are easy. It's about who learns to show up when things are hard. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do isn't holding on to anger. It's choosing to build something stronger than it. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own family, your own choices, your own second chances, take a moment. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you believe in stories that carry meaning, that remind us what matters, stay with us. There's always another story worth telling.